The first step of this strategy is to identify the main high-level goals in both your professional and your personal life. If you have a family, for example, then your personal goals might involve parenting well and running an organized household. In the professional sphere, the details of these goals depend on what you do for a living. In my own work as a professor, for example, I pursue two important goals. One centered on being an effective teacher in the classroom and effective mentor to my graduate students, and another centered on being an effective researcher. While your goals will likely differ, the key is to keep the list limited to what's most important, and to keep the description suitably high level. If your goal includes a specific target, to reach $1 million in sales, or to publish a half-dozen papers in a single year, then it's too specific for our purposes here. When you're done, you should have a small number of goals for both the personal and professional areas of your life. Once you've identified these goals, list for each the 2 or 3 most important activities that help you satisfy the goal. These activities should be specific enough to allow you to clearly picture doing them. On the other hand, they should be general enough that they're not tied to a one-time outcome. For example, do better research is too general. What does it look like to be doing better research? While finish paper on broadcast lower bounds in time for upcoming conference submission is too specific. It's a one-time outcome. A good activity in this context would be something like, regularly read and understand the cutting-edge results in my field. The next step in this strategy is to consider the network tools you currently use. For each such tool, go through the key activities you identified and ask whether the use of the tool has a substantially positive impact, a substantially negative impact, or little impact on your regular and successful participation in the activity. Now comes the important decision. Keep using this tool only if you concluded that it has substantial positive impacts and that these outweigh the negative impacts. To help illustrate this strategy in action, let's consider a case study. For the purposes of this example, assume that Michael Lewis, if asked, would have produced the following goal and corresponding important activities for his writing career. Professional goal: to craft well-written, narrative-driven stories that change the way people understand the world. Key activities supporting this goal: research patiently and deeply. Write carefully and with purpose. Now imagine that Lewis was using this goal to determine whether or not to use Twitter. Our strategy requires him to investigate Twitter's impact on the key activities he listed that support his goal. There's no convincing way to argue that Twitter would make Lewis substantially better at either of these activities. Deep research for Lewis, I assume, requires him to spend weeks and months getting to know a small number of sources. He's a master of the long-form journalism skill of drawing out a source's story over many sessions, and careful writing, of course, requires freedom from distraction. In both cases, Twitter, at best, has no real impact, and at worst could be substantially negative, depending on Lewis's susceptibility to the service's addictive attributes. The conclusion would therefore be that Lewis shouldn't use Twitter. You might argue at this point that confining our example to this single goal is artificial, as it ignores the areas where a service like Twitter has its best chance of contributing. For writers, in particular, Twitter is often presented as a tool to establish connections with your audience that ultimately lead to more sales. For a writer like Michael Lewis, however, marketing doesn't likely merit its own goal when he assesses what's important in his professional life. This follows because his reputation guarantees that he will receive massive coverage in massively influential media channels if the book is really good. His focus, therefore, is much more productively applied to the goal of writing the best possible book than instead trying to squeeze out a few extra sales through inefficient author-driven means. In other words, the question is not whether Twitter has some conceivable benefit to Lewis. It's instead whether Twitter use significantly and positively affects the most important activities in his professional life. What about a less famous writer? In this case, book marketing might play a more primary role in his or her goals. But when forced to identify the 2 or 3 most important activities supporting this goal, it's unlikely that the type of lightweight, one-on-one contact enabled by Twitter would make the list. This is the result of simple math. Imagine that our hypothetical author diligently sends 10 individualized tweets a day, 5 days a week, each of which connects one-on-one with a new potential reader. Now imagine that 50% of the people contacted in this manner become loyal fans who will definitely buy the author's next book. Over the 2-year period it might take to write this book, this yields 2,000 sales, a modest boost at best in a marketplace where bestseller status requires 2 or 3 times more sales per week. The question, once again, is not whether Twitter offers some benefits, but instead whether it offers enough benefits to offset its drag on your time and attention, 2 resources that are especially valuable to a writer. Having seen an example of this approach applied to a professional context, let's next consider the potentially more disruptive setting of personal goals. In particular, let's apply this approach to one of our culture's most ubiquitous and fiercely defended tools, Facebook. When justifying the use of Facebook or similar social networks, most people cite its importance to their social lives. With this in mind, let's apply our strategy to understand whether Facebook makes the cut due to its positive impact on this aspect of our personal goals. To do so, we'll once again work with a hypothetical goal and key supporting activities. Personal goal: to maintain close and rewarding friendships with a group of people who are important to me. Key activities supporting this goal: 1. Regularly take the time for meaningful connection with those who are most important to me, e.g., a long talk, a meal, joint activity. 2. Give of myself to those who are most important to me, e.g., making non-trivial sacrifices that improve their lives. Not everyone will share this exact goal or supporting activities, but hopefully you'll stipulate that they apply to many people. Let's now step back and apply our strategy's filtering logic to the example of Facebook in the context of this personal goal. This service, of course, offers any number of benefits to your social life. To name a few that are often mentioned, it allows you to catch up with people you haven't seen in a while. It allows you to maintain lightweight contact with people you know but don't run into regularly. It allows you to more easily monitor important events in people's lives, such as whether or not they're married or what their new baby looks like. And it allows you to stumble onto online communities or groups that match your interests. These are real benefits that Facebook undeniably offers, but none of these benefits provide a significant positive impact to the 2 key activities we listed, both of which are offline and effort-intensive. Our strategy, therefore, would return a perhaps surprising but clear conclusion. Of course, Facebook offers benefits to your social life, but none are important enough to what really matters to you in this area to justify giving it access to your time and attention. To be clear, I'm not arguing that everyone should stop using Facebook. I'm instead showing that for this specific representative case study, the strategy proposed here would suggest dropping this service. I can imagine, however, other plausible scenarios that would lead to the opposite conclusion. Consider, for example, a college freshman. For someone in this situation, it might be more important to establish new friendships than to support existing relationships. The activities this student identifies for supporting his goal of a thriving social life, therefore, might include something like attend lots of events and socialize with lots of different people. If this is a key activity and you're on a college campus, then a tool like Facebook would have a substantially positive impact and should be used. To give another example, consider someone in the military who's deployed overseas. For this hypothetical soldier, keeping in frequent, lightweight touch with friends and family left back home is a plausible priority, and one that might once again be best supported through social networks. What should be clear from these examples is that this strategy, if applied as described, will lead many people who currently use tools like Facebook or Twitter to abandon them. But not everyone. You might at this point complain about the arbitrariness of allowing only a small number of activities to dominate your decisions about such tools. As we established previously, for example, Facebook has many benefits to your social life. Why would one abandon it just because it doesn't happen to help the small number of activities that we judged most important? What's key to understand here, however, is that this radical reduction of priorities is not arbitrary, but is instead motivated by an idea that has arisen repeatedly in any number of different fields, from client profitability to social equality to prevention of crashes in computer programs. The law of the vital few. In many settings, 80% of a given effect is due to just 20% of the possible causes. For example, it might be the case that 80% of a business's profits come from just 20% of its clients. 80% of a nation's wealth is held by its richest 20% of citizens, or 80% of computer software crashes come from just 20% of the identified bugs. There's a formal mathematical underpinning to this phenomenon. An 80-20 split is roughly what you would expect when describing a power law distribution over impact, a type of distribution that shows up often when measuring quantities in the real world. But it's probably most useful when applied heuristically as a reminder that, in many cases, contributions to an outcome are not evenly distributed. Moving forward, let's assume that this law holds for the important goals in your life. As we noted, many different activities can contribute to your achieving these goals. The law of the vital few, however, reminds us that the most important 20% or so of these activities provide the bulk of the benefit. Assuming that you could probably list somewhere between 10 and 15 distinct and potentially beneficial activities for each of your life goals, this law says that it's the top 2 or 3 such activities, the number that this strategy asks you to focus on, that make most of the difference in whether or not you succeed with the goal. Even if you accept this result, however, you still might argue that you shouldn't ignore the other 80% of possible beneficial activities. It's true that these less important activities don't contribute nearly as much to your goal as your top 1 or 2, but they can provide some benefit, so why not keep them in the mix? As long as you don't ignore the more important activities, it seems like it can't hurt to also support some of the less important alternatives. This argument, however, misses the key point that all activities, regardless of their importance, consume your same limited store of time and attention. If you service low-impact activities, therefore, you're taking away time you could be spending on higher-impact activities. It's a zero-sum game. And because your time returns substantially more rewards when invested in high-impact activities than when invested in low-impact activities, the more of it you shift to the latter, the lower your overall benefit. The business world understands this math. This is why it's not uncommon to see a company fire unproductive clients. If 80% of their profits come from 20% of their clients, then they make more money by redirecting the energy from low-revenue clients to better service the small number of lucrative contracts. Each hour spent on the latter returns more revenue than each hour spent on the former. The same holds true for your professional and personal goals. By taking the time consumed by low-impact activities, like finding old friends on Facebook, and reinvesting it in high-impact activities, like taking a good friend out to lunch, you end up more successful in your goal. To abandon a network tool using this logic, therefore, is not to miss out on its potential small benefits, but is instead to get more out of the activities you already know to yield large benefits. To return to where we started, for Malcolm Gladwell, Michael Lewis, and George Packer, Twitter doesn't support the 20% of activities that generate the bulk of the success in their writing careers. Even though in isolation, this service might return some minor benefits when their careers are viewed as a whole, they're likely more successful not using Twitter and redirecting that time to more fruitful activities than if they added it into their schedule as one more thing to manage. You should take the same care in deciding which tools you allow to claim your own limited time and attention. Quit social media. When Ryan Nicodemus decided to simplify his life, one of his first targets was his possessions. At the time, Ryan lived alone in a spacious 3-bedroom condo. For years, driven by a consumerist impulse, he had been trying his best to fill this ample space. Now, it was time to reclaim his life from his stuff. The strategy he deployed was simple to describe, but radical in concept. He spent an afternoon packing everything he owned into cardboard boxes, as if he was about to move. In order to transform what he described as a difficult undertaking into something less onerous, he called it a packing party, explaining, "Everything's more exciting when it's a party, right?" Once the packing was done, Nicodemus then spent the next week going through his normal routine. If he needed something that was packed, he would unpack it and put it back where it used to go. At the end of the week, he noticed that the vast majority of his stuff remained untouched in its boxes, so he got rid of it. Stuff accumulates in people's lives, in part because when faced with a specific act of elimination, it's easy to worry. What if I need this one day? And then use this worry as an excuse to keep the item in question sitting around. Nicodemus's packing party provided him with definitive evidence that most of his stuff was not something he needed, and it therefore supported his quest to simplify. The last strategy provided a systematic method to help you begin sorting through the network tools that currently lay claim to your time and attention. This strategy offers you a different but complementary approach to these same issues. and it's inspired by Ryan Nicodemus's approach to getting rid of his useless stuff. In more detail, this strategy asks that you perform the equivalent of a packing party on the social media services that you currently use. Instead of packing, however, you'll instead ban yourself from using them for 30 days. All of them. Facebook, Instagram, Google+, Twitter, Snapchat, Vine, or whatever other services have risen to popularity since I first wrote these words. Don't formally deactivate these services, and this is important. Don't mention online that you'll be signing off. Just stop using them, cold turkey. If someone reaches out to you by other means and asks why your activity on a particular service has fallen off, you can explain, but don't go out of your way to tell people. After 30 days of this self-imposed network isolation, ask yourself the following 2 questions about each of the services you temporarily quit. 1. Would the last 30 days have been notably better if I'd been able to use this service? 2. Did people care that I wasn't using this service? If your answer is no to both questions, quit the service permanently. If your answer was a clear yes, then return to using the service. If your answers are qualified or ambiguous, it's up to you whether you return to the service, though I would encourage you to lean toward quitting. You can always rejoin later. This strategy picks specifically on social media because among the different network tools that can claim your time and attention, these services, if used without limit, can be particularly devastating to your quest to work deeper. They offer personalized information arriving on an unpredictable, intermittent schedule, making them massively addictive, and therefore capable of severely damaging your attempts to schedule and succeed with any act of concentration. Given these dangers, you might expect that more knowledge workers would avoid these tools altogether, especially those like computer programmers or writers whose livelihood explicitly depends on the outcome of deep work. But part of what makes social media insidious is that the companies that profit from your attention have succeeded with a masterful marketing coup, convincing our culture that if you don't use their products, you might miss out. This fear that you might miss out has obvious parallels to Nicodemus's fear that the voluminous stuff in his closets might one day prove useful, which is why I'm suggesting a corrective strategy that parallels his packing party. By spending a month without these services, you can replace your fear that you might miss out on events, on conversations, on shared cultural experience with a dose of reality. For most people, this reality will confirm something that seems obvious only once you've done the hard work of freeing yourself from the marketing messages surrounding these tools. They're not really all that important in your life. The reason why I ask you to not announce your 30-day experiment is because, for some people, another part of the delusion that binds them to social media is the idea that people want to hear what you have to say, and that they might be disappointed if you suddenly leave them bereft of your commentary. I'm being somewhat facetious here in my wording, but this underlying sentiment is nonetheless common and important to tackle. As of this writing, for example, the average number of followers for a Twitter user is 208. When you know that more than 200 people volunteered to hear what you have to say, it's easy to begin to believe that your activities on these services are important. Speaking from experience, as someone who makes a living trying to sell my ideas to people, this is a powerfully addictive feeling. But here's the reality of audiences in a social media era. Before these services existed, building an audience of any size beyond your immediate friends and family required hard, competitive work. In the early 2000s, for example, anyone could start a blog, but to gain even just a handful of unique visitors per month required that you actually put in the work to deliver information that's valuable enough to capture someone's attention. I know this difficulty well. My first blog was started in the fall of 2003. It was called, cleverly enough, Inspiring Moniker. I used it to muse on my life as a 21-year-old college student. There were, I'm embarrassed to admit, long stretches where no one read it, a term I'm using literally. As I learned in the decade that followed, a period in which I patiently and painstakingly built an audience for my current blog, Study Hacks, from a handful of readers to hundreds of thousands per month, is that earning people's attention online is hard work. Except now it's not. Part of what fueled social media's rapid ascent, I contend, is its ability to short-circuit this connection between the hard work of producing real value and the positive reward of having people pay attention to you. It has instead replaced this timeless capitalist exchange with a shallow collectivist alternative. I'll pay attention to what you say if you pay attention to what I say, regardless of its value. A blog or magazine or television program that contain the content that typically populates a Facebook wall or Twitter feed, for example, would attract, on average, no audience. But when captured within the social conventions of these services, that same content will attract attention in the form of likes and comments. The implicit agreement motivating this behavior is that in return for receiving, for the most part, undeserved attention from your friends and followers, you'll return the favor by lavishing, similarly undeserved, attention on them. You like my status update, and I'll like yours. This agreement gives everyone a simulacrum of importance without requiring much effort in return. By dropping off these services without notice, you can test the reality of your status as a content producer. For most people and most services, the news might be sobering. No one outside your closest friends and family will likely even notice you've signed off. I recognize that I come across as curmudgeonly when talking about this issue. Is there any other way to tackle it? But it's important to discuss, because this quest for self-importance plays an important role in convincing people to continue to thoughtlessly fragment their time and attention. For some people, of course, this 30-day experiment will be difficult and generate lots of issues. If you're a college student or online personality, for example, the abstention will complicate your life and will be noted. But for most, I suspect, the net result of this experiment, if not a massive overhaul in your internet habits, will be a more grounded view of the role social media plays in your daily existence. These services aren't necessarily, as advertised, the lifeblood of our modern connected world. They're just products developed by private companies, funded lavishly, marketed carefully, and designed ultimately to capture, then sell your personal information and attention to advertisers. They can be fun, but in the scheme of your life and what you want to accomplish, they're a lightweight whimsy, one unimportant distraction among many threatening to derail you from something deeper. Or maybe social media tools are at the core of your existence. You won't know either way until you sample life without them. Don't use the internet to entertain yourself. Arnold Bennett was an English writer born near the turn of the 20th century, a tumultuous time for his home country's economy. The Industrial Revolution, which had been roaring for decades by this point, had wrenched enough surplus capital from the empire's resources to generate a new class, the white-collar worker. It was now possible to have a job in which you spent a set number of hours a week in an office, and in exchange received a steady salary sufficient to support a household. Such a lifestyle is blandly familiar in our current age, but to Bennett and his contemporaries, it was novel and in many ways distressing. Chief among Bennett's concerns was that members of this new class were missing out on the opportunities it presented to live a full life. Take the case of a Londoner who works in an office, whose office hours are from 10 to 6, and who spends 50 minutes morning and night in traveling between his house door and his office door. Bennett writes in his 1910 self-help classic, How to Live on 24 Hours a Day. This hypothetical London salaryman, he notes, has a little more than 16 hours left in the day beyond these work-related hours. To Bennett, this is a lot of time, but most people in this situation tragically don't realize its potential. The great and profound mistake which my typical man makes in regard to his day, he elaborates, is that even though he doesn't particularly enjoy his work, seeing it as something to get through, he persists in looking upon those hours from 10 to 6 as the day, to which the 10 hours preceding them and the 6 hours following them are nothing but a prologue and epilogue. This is an attitude that Bennett condemns as utterly illogical and unhealthy. What's the alternative to this state of affairs? Bennett suggests that his typical man see his 16 free hours as a day within a day, explaining, during those 16 hours he is free. He is not a wage earner. He is not preoccupied with monetary cares. He is just as good as a man with a private income. Accordingly, the typical man should instead use this time as an aristocrat would, to perform rigorous self-improvement, a task that, according to Bennett, involves primarily reading great literature and poetry. Bennett wrote about these issues more than a century ago. You might expect that in the intervening decades, a period in which this middle class exploded in size worldwide, our thinking about leisure time would have evolved, but it has not. If anything, with the rise of the internet and the lowbrow attention economy it supports, the average 40-hour-a-week employee, especially those in my tech-savvy millennial generation, has seen the quality of his or her leisure time remain degraded, consisting primarily of a blur of distracted clicks on least common denominator digital entertainment. If Bennett were brought back to life today, he'd likely fall into despair at the lack of progress in this area of human development. To be clear, I'm indifferent to the moral underpinnings behind Bennett's suggestions. His vision of elevating the souls and minds of the middle class by reading poetry and great books feels somewhat antiquated and classist. But the logical foundation of his proposal, that you both should and can make deliberate use of your time outside work, remains relevant today, especially with respect to the goal of this rule, which is to reduce the impact of network tools on your ability to perform deep work. In more detail, in the strategies discussed so far in this rule, we haven't spent much time yet on a class of network tools that are particularly relevant to the fight for depth. Entertainment-focused websites designed to capture and hold your attention for as long as possible. At the time of this writing, the most popular examples of such sites include the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Business Insider, and Reddit. This list will undoubtedly continue to evolve, but what this general category of sites shares is the use of carefully crafted titles and easily digestible content, often honed by algorithms to be maximally attention-catching. Once you've landed on one article in one of these sites, links on the side or bottom of the page beckon you to click on another, then another. Every available trick of human psychology, from listing titles as popular or trending to the use of arresting photos, is used to keep you engaged. At this particular moment, for example, some of the most popular articles on BuzzFeed include 17 words that mean something totally different when spelled backward, and 33 dogs winning at everything. These sites are especially harmful after the workday is over, where the freedom in your schedule enables them to become central to your leisure time. If you're waiting in line, or waiting for the plot to pick up in a TV show, or waiting to finish eating a meal, they provide a cognitive crutch to ensure you eliminate any chance of boredom. As I argued in rule number 2, however, such behavior is dangerous, as it weakens your mind's general ability to resist distraction, making deep work difficult later when you really want to concentrate. To make matters worse, these network tools are not something you join, and therefore they're not something you can remove from your life by quitting, rendering the previous 2 strategies irrelevant. They're always available, just a click away. Fortunately, Arnold Bennett identified the solution to this problem 100 years earlier. Put more thought into your leisure time. In other words, this strategy suggests that when it comes to your relaxation, don't default to whatever catches your attention at the moment, but instead dedicate some advanced thinking to the question of how you want to spend your day within a day. Addictive websites of the type mentioned previously thrive in a vacuum. If you haven't given yourself something to do in a given moment, they'll always beckon as an appealing option. If you instead fill this free time with something of more quality, their grip on your attention will loosen. It's crucial, therefore, that you figure out in advance what you're going to do with your evenings and weekends before they begin. Structured hobbies provide good fodder for these hours, as they generate specific actions with specific goals to fill your time. A set program of reading, a la Bennett, where you spend regular time each night making progress on a series of deliberately chosen books, is also a good option, as is, of course, exercise or the enjoyment of good in-person company. In my own life, for example, I managed to read a surprising number of books in a typical year, given the demands on my time as a professor, writer, and father. On average, I'm typically reading 3 to 5 books at a time. This is possible because one of my favorite pre-planned leisure activities after my kids' bedtime is to read an interesting book. As a result, my smartphone and computer and the distractions they can offer typically remain neglected between the end of the workday and the next morning. At this point, you might worry that adding such structure to your relaxation will defeat the purpose of relaxing, which many believe requires complete freedom from plans or obligations. Won't a structured evening leave you exhausted, not refreshed, the next day at work? Bennett, to his credit, anticipated this complaint. As he argues, such worries misunderstand what energizes the human spirit. What? You say that full energy given to those 16 hours will lessen the value of the business 8? Not so. On the contrary, it will assuredly increase the value of the business 8. One of the chief things which my typical man has to learn is that the mental faculties are capable of a continuous hard activity. They do not tire like an arm or a leg. All they want is change, not rest, except in sleep. In my experience, this analysis is spot on. If you give your mind to something meaningful to do throughout all your waking hours, you'll end the day more fulfilled and begin the next one more relaxed than if you instead allow your mind to bathe for hours in semi-conscious and unstructured web surfing. To summarize, if you want to eliminate the addictive pull of entertainment sites on your time and attention, give your brain a quality alternative. Not only will this preserve your ability to resist distraction and concentrate, but you might even fulfill Arnold Bennett's ambitious goal of experiencing, perhaps for the first time, what it means to live and not just exist. Rule number 4. Drain the shallows. In the summer of 2007, the software company 37 Signals, now called Basecamp, launched an experiment. They shortened their work week from 5 days to 4. Their employees seemed to accomplish the same amount of work with one less day, so they made this change permanent. Every year, from May through October, 37 Signals employees work only Monday to Thursday, with the exception of customer support, which still operates the full week. As company co-founder Jason Fried quipped in a blog post about the decision, people should enjoy the weather in the summer. It didn't take long before the grumbles began in the business press. A few months after Fried announced his company's decision to make 4-day weeks permanent, journalist Tara Weiss wrote a critical piece for Forbes titled, "Why a 4-Day Work Week Doesn't Work." She summarized her problem with this strategy as follows. Packing 40 hours into 4 days isn't necessarily an efficient way to work. Many people find that 8 hours are tough enough. Requiring them to stay for an extra 2 could cause morale and productivity to decrease. Fried was quick to respond. In a blog post titled, "Forbes Misses the Point of the 4-Day Workweek," he begins by agreeing with Weiss's premise that it would be stressful for employees to cram 40 hours of effort into 4 days. But, as he clarifies, that's not what he's suggesting. The point of the 4-day workweek is about doing less work, he writes. It's not about 4 10-hour days, it's about 4 normalish 8-hour days. This might seem confusing at first. Fried earlier claimed that his employees get just as much done in 4 days as in 5 days. Now, however, he's claiming that his employees are working fewer hours. How can both be true? The difference, it turns out, concerns the role of shallow work. As Fried explains, very few people work even 8 hours a day. You're lucky if you get a few good hours in between all the meetings, interruptions, web surfing, office politics, and personal business that permeate the typical workday. Fewer official working hours help squeeze the fat out of the typical work week. Once everyone has less time to get their stuff done, they respect that time even more. People become stingy with their time, and that's a good thing. They don't waste it on things that just don't matter. When you have fewer hours, you usually spend them more wisely. In other words, the reduction in the 37 Signals work week disproportionately eliminated shallow as compared to deep work, and because the latter was left largely untouched, the important stuff continued to get done. The shallow stuff that can seem so urgent in the moment turned out to be unexpectedly dispensable. A natural reaction to this experiment is to wonder what would happen if 37 Signals had gone one step further. If eliminating hours of shallow work had little impact on the results produced, what would happen if they not only eliminated shallow work, but then replaced this newly recovered time with more deep work? Fortunately for our curiosity, the company soon put this bolder idea to the test as well. Fried had always been interested in the policies of technology companies like Google that gave their employees 20% of their time to work on self-directed projects. While he liked this idea, he felt that carving one day out of an otherwise busy week was not enough to support the type of unbroken deep work that generates true breakthroughs. "I'd take 5 days in a row over 5 days spread out over 5 weeks, he explained. So our theory is that we'll see better results when people have a long stretch of uninterrupted time. To test this theory, 37 Signals implemented something radical. The company gave its employees the entire month of June off to work deeply on their own projects. This month would be a period free of any shallow work obligations. No status meetings, no memos, and, blessedly, no PowerPoint. At the end of the month, the company held a pitch day in which employees pitched the ideas they'd been working on. Summarizing the experiment in an Inc. magazine article, Fried dubbed it a success. The pitch day produced 2 projects that were soon put into production: a better suite of tools for handling customer support, and a data visualization system that helps the company understand how their customers use their products. These projects are predicted to bring substantial value to the company, but they almost certainly would not have been produced in the absence of the unobstructed deep work time provided to the employees. To tease out their potential required dozens of hours of unimpeded effort. "How can we afford to put our business on hold for a month to mess around with new ideas?" Fried asked rhetorically. "How can we afford not to?" 37 Signals experiments highlight an important reality. The shallow work that increasingly dominates the time and attention of knowledge workers is less vital than it often seems in the moment. For most businesses, if you eliminated significant amounts of this shallowness, their bottom line would likely remain unaffected. And as Jason Fried discovered, if you not only eliminate shallow work, but also replace this recovered time with more of the deep alternative, not only will the business continue to function, it can become more successful. This rule asks you to apply these insights to your personal work life. The strategies that follow are designed to help you ruthlessly identify the shallowness in your current schedule, then cull it down to minimum levels, leaving more time for the deep efforts that ultimately matter most. Before diving into the details of these strategies, however, we should first confront the reality that there's a limit to this anti-shallow thinking. The value of deep work vastly outweighs the value of shallow. But this doesn't mean that you must quixotically pursue a schedule in which all of your time is invested in depth. For one thing, a non-trivial amount of shallow work is needed to maintain most knowledge work jobs. You might be able to avoid checking your email every 10 minutes, but you won't likely last long if you never respond to important messages. In this sense, we should see the goal of this rule as taming shallow work's footprint in your schedule, not eliminating it. Then there's the issue of cognitive capacity. Deep work is exhausting because it pushes you toward the limit of your abilities. Performance psychologists have extensively studied how much such efforts can be sustained by an individual in a given day. In their seminal paper on deliberate practice, Anders Ericsson and his collaborators survey these studies. They note that for someone new to such practice, citing in particular a child in the early stages of developing an expert-level skill, an hour a day is a reasonable limit. For those familiar with the rigors of such activities, the limit expands to something like 4 hours, but rarely more. The implication is that once you've hit your deep work limit in a given day, you'll experience diminishing rewards if you try to cram in more. Shallow work, therefore, doesn't become dangerous until after you add enough to begin to crowd out your bounded deep efforts for the day. At first, this caveat might seem optimistic. The typical workday is 8 hours. The most adept deep thinker cannot spend more than 4 of these hours in a state of true depth. It follows that you can safely spend half the day wallowing in the shallows without adverse effect. The danger missed by this analysis is how easily this amount of time can be consumed, especially once you consider the impact of meetings, appointments, calls, and other scheduled events. For many jobs, these time drains can leave you with surprisingly little time left for solo work. My job as a professor, for example, is traditionally less plagued by such commitments, but even so, they often take large chunks out of my time, especially during the academic year. Turning to a random day in my calendar from the previous semester, I'm writing this during a quiet summer month. For example, I see I had a meeting from 11 to 12, another from 1 to 2:30, and a class to teach from 3 to 5. My 8-hour workday in this example is already reduced by 4 hours. Even if I squeezed all remaining shallow work, emails, tasks, into a single half hour, I'd still fall short of the goal of 4 hours of daily deep work. Put another way, even though we're not capable of spending a full day in a state of blissful depth, this reality shouldn't reduce the urgency of reducing shallow work, as the typical knowledge workday is more easily fragmented than many suspect. To summarize, I'm asking you to treat shallow work with suspicion, because its damage is often vastly underestimated, and its importance vastly overestimated. This type of work is inevitable, but you must keep it confined to a point where it doesn't impede your ability to take full advantage of the deeper efforts that ultimately determine your impact. The strategies that follow will help you act on this reality. Schedule every minute of your day. If you're between the ages of 25 and 34 years old and live in Britain, you likely watch more television than you realize. In 2013, the British TV Licensing Authority surveyed television watchers about their habits. The 25 to 34-year-olds taking the survey estimated that they spend somewhere between 15 and 16 hours per week watching TV. This sounds like a lot, but it's actually a significant underestimate. We know this because when it comes to television watching habits, we have access to the ground truth. The Broadcasters Audience Research Board, the British equivalent of the American Nielsen Company, places meters in a representative sample of households. These meters record, without bias or wishful thinking, exactly how much people actually watch. The 25 to 34-year-olds who thought they watched 15 hours a week, it turns out, watch more like 28 hours. This bad estimate of time usage is not unique to British television watching. When you consider different groups self-estimating different behaviors, similar gaps stubbornly remain. In a Wall Street Journal article on the topic, business writer Laura Vanderkam pointed out several more such examples. A survey by the National Sleep Foundation revealed that Americans think they're sleeping, on average, somewhere around 7 hours a night. The American Time Use Survey, which has people actually measure their sleep, corrected this number to 8.6 hours. Another study found that people who claim to work 60 to 64 hours per week we're actually averaging more like 44 hours per week, while those claiming to work more than 75 hours, we're actually working less than 55. These examples underscore an important point. We spend much of our day on autopilot, not giving much thought to what we're doing with our time. This is a problem. It's difficult to prevent the trivial from creeping into every corner of your schedule if you don't face, without flinching, your current balance between deep and shallow work, and then adopt the habit of pausing before action and asking, what makes the most sense right now? The strategy described in the following paragraphs is designed to force you into these behaviors. It's an idea that might seem extreme at first, but will soon prove indispensable in your quest to take full advantage of the value of deep work. Schedule every minute of your day. Here's my suggestion. At the beginning of each workday, turn to a new page of lined paper in a notebook you dedicate to this purpose. Down the left-hand side of the page, mark every other line with an hour of the day, covering the full set of hours you typically work. Now comes the important part. Divide the hours of your workday into blocks and assign activities to the blocks. For example, you might block off 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. for writing a client's press release. To do so, actually draw a box that covers the lines corresponding to these hours. Then, write press release inside the box. Not every block need be dedicated to a work task. There might be time blocks for lunch or relaxation breaks. To keep things reasonably clean, the minimum length of a block should be 30 minutes, i.e., one line on your page. This means, for example, that instead of having a unique small box for each small task on your plate for the day, respond to boss's email, submit reimbursement form, ask Carl about report. You can batch similar things into more generic task blocks. You might find it useful, in this case, to draw a line from a task block to the open right-hand side of the page where you can list out the full set of small tasks you plan to accomplish in that block. When you're done scheduling your day, every minute should be part of a block. You have, in effect, given every minute of your workday a job. Now, as you go through your day, use this schedule to guide you. It's here, of course, that most people will begin to run into trouble. Two things can and likely will go wrong with your schedule once the day progresses. The first is that your estimates will prove wrong. You might put aside 2 hours for writing a press release, for example, and in reality, it takes 2.5 hours. The second problem is that you'll be interrupted, and new obligations will unexpectedly appear on your plate. These events will also break your schedule. This is okay. If your schedule is disrupted, you should, at the next available moment, take a few minutes to create a revised schedule for the time that remains in the day. You can turn to a new page, you can erase and redraw blocks, or do as I do, cross out the blocks for the remainder of the day and create new blocks to the right of the old ones on the page. I draw my blocks skinny so I have room for several revisions. On some days, you might rewrite your schedule half a dozen times. Don't despair if this happens. Your goal is not to stick to a given schedule at all costs. It's instead to maintain at all times a thoughtful say in what you're doing with your time going forward, even if these decisions are reworked again and again as the day unfolds. If you find that schedule revisions become overwhelming in their frequency, there are a few tactics that can inject some more stability. First, you should recognize that almost definitely you're going to underestimate at first how much time you require for most things. When people are new to this habit, they tend to use their schedule as an incarnation of wishful thinking, a best-case scenario for their day. Over time, you should make an effort to accurately, if not somewhat conservatively, predict the time tasks will require. The second tactic that helps is the use of overflow conditional blocks. If you're not sure how long a given activity might take, block off the expected time, then follow this with an additional block that has a split purpose. If you need more time for the preceding activity, use this additional block to keep working on it. If you finish the activity on time, however, have an alternate use already assigned for the extra block, for example, some non-urgent tasks. This allows unpredictability in your day without requiring you to keep changing your schedule on paper. For example, returning to our press release example, you might schedule 2 hours for writing the press release, but then follow it by an additional hour block that you can use to keep writing the release if needed, but otherwise assigned to catching up with email. The third tactic I suggest is to be liberal with your use of task blocks. Deploy many throughout your day and make them longer than required to handle the tasks you plan in the morning. Lots of things come up during the typical knowledge worker's day. Having regularly occurring blocks of time to address these surprises keeps things running smoothly. Before leaving you to put this strategy in practice, I should address a common objection. In my experience pitching the values of daily schedules, I found that many people worry that this level of planning will become burdensomely restrictive. Here, for example, is part of a comment from a reader named Joseph on a blog post I wrote on this topic. I think you far understate the role of uncertainty. I worry about readers applying these observations too seriously, to the point of an obsessive and unhealthy relationship with one's schedule that seems to exaggerate the importance of minute counting over getting lost in activities, which, if we're talking about artists, is often the only really sensible course of action. I understand these concerns, and Joseph is certainly not the first to raise them. Fortunately, however, they're also easily addressed. In my own daily scheduling discipline, in addition to regularly scheduling significant blocks of time for speculative thinking and discussion, I maintain a rule that if I stumble onto an important insight, then this is a perfectly valid reason to ignore the rest of my schedule for the day, with the exception, of course, of things that cannot be skipped. I can then stick with this unexpected insight until it loses steam. At this point, I'll step back and rebuild my schedule for any time that remains in the day. In other words, I not only allow spontaneity in my schedule, I encourage it. Joseph's critique is driven by the mistaken idea that the goal of a schedule is to force your behavior into a rigid plan. This type of scheduling, however, isn't about constraint. It's instead about thoughtfulness. It's a simple habit that forces you to continually take a moment throughout your day and ask, what makes sense for me to do with the time that remains? It's the habit of asking that returns results, not your unyielding fidelity to the answer. I would go so far as to argue that someone following this combination of comprehensive scheduling and a willingness to adapt or modify the plan as needed will likely experience more creative insights than someone who adopts a more traditionally spontaneous approach, where the day is left open and unstructured. Without structure, it's easy to allow your time to devolve into the shallow. Email, social media, web surfing, This type of shallow behavior, though satisfying in the moment, is not conducive to creativity. With structure, on the other hand, you can ensure that you regularly schedule blocks to grapple with a new idea, or work deeply on something challenging, or brainstorm for a fixed period. The type of commitment more likely to instigate innovation. Recall, for example, the discussion in rule number 1 about the rigid rituals followed by many great creative thinkers. And because you're willing to abandon your plan when an innovative idea arises, you're just as well suited as the distracted creative to follow up when the muse strikes. To summarize, the motivation for this strategy is the recognition that a deep work habit requires you to treat your time with respect. A good first step toward this respectful handling is the advice outlined here. Decide in advance what you're going to do with every minute of your workday. It's natural at first to resist this idea, as it's undoubtedly easier to continue to allow the twin forces of internal whim and external requests to drive your schedule. But you must overcome this distrust of structure if you want to approach your true potential as someone who creates things that matter.